Thank you for watching this video as always. I greatly appreciate your viewership, your comments, your likes, and your support as we go through this. As I said in my last video, I'd planned this video as a part of, I have most of my videos planned out weeks ahead of time, and then I talk about them. It's just the unfortunate occurrence of President Carter's death also coincides with this, so we'll see how the reaction is to things I'm getting ready to talk about. A friend of mine recently asked me, because as you may suspect, I am pretty outspoken about all of this stuff that I talk in these videos in my normal life as well as in these videos. I just felt I could reach a larger platform and vent my frustrations through these videos than I can just talking with my friends. But this friend, who's a very good friend of mine, recently asked me what the point of talking about all of the negative things that the United States presidents have done through the history of this country, post-World War II at least, means. It's important because it's important to understand and grasp that no American president since World War II, even probably before then, but we're only talking post-World War II era, Republican or Democrat, has been a president of the common working class or poor people of America, the majority. Each president, no matter their political affiliation, has always acted out in the interest of big business and the private corporate sector. Jimmy Carter is no different. Whether it be his domestic or foreign policies, Jimmy Carter's administration implemented the big business agenda and did multiple things to start the downward spiral of true American democracy that had already been degrading for years. We're going to discuss, as we do with the United States presidents, Jimmy Carter's foreign policy, then his domestic policy. Then we're going to go ahead and talk about the Camp David Accords and his actions and how they affected the Israel-Palestine situation and so on and so forth, before I get into my usual spiel about the first links in the description for the United States Campaign for Palestinian Rights and other ways that you could be active in trying to stop the ongoing genocide of Gazans right now. So we're going to go ahead and start with Carter's foreign policy. Carter was supposed to be the humanitarian president. He lauded himself as being someone who is going to do multiple different things that will hopefully lead to quote-unquote world peace. He was not the first president nor the last president to say these types of things. Kennedy gave a really good speech about how we're fighting for world peace, but we'll get to Kennedy one day. That's not today. But how did Carter actually affect the foreign policy as it pertains to world peace? Well, he did a lot of things that, because he was such a short term in office and because there was at this point in Congress, because of the massive push of the peace movement, a big push for less aggressive foreign policy by the United States, Carter did not do as much stuff as we'll talk about with Reagan or Nixon, Kennedy, Johnson, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, Obama, Trump, Biden, or probably Trump again. But Carter did do a lot of damage during his time here. Before we get into the direct actions of the Carter administration and how they affected the world, we're going to talk about indirect actions and things that he led to deny people throughout his administration. We talked about it during my invasion of Vietnam by the United States video, but after the United States destroyed Vietnam, left it in total disarray from the agriculture to the cities to anything in between, Vietnam was in desperate need of humanitarian aid. In fact, there is a still big push there for people to go in and deactivate some of the unexploded bombs that have been left there. And the United States continues to not let this happen for one reason or another. The Carter administration was no different. When Vietnam asked for humanitarian aid to be put through, Carter said that they would not do that because, quote, the cost was equal. Now, once again, you can go back to the invasion of Vietnam video I did a couple weeks ago for more information on this, but suffice to say, the cost was not equal. For every death of an American soldier, there was 10 to 15 Vietnamese people killed. Not Vietnamese soldiers, not the National Liberation Front's soldiers, people, civilians, women, children who were murdered for every one American soldier. So that doesn't really seem equal to me, but that didn't stop the Carter administration, the humanitarian president, from denying this aid to Vietnam. Carter also denied any wrongdoing by the CIA through their involvement in Chile, which led to tens of thousands of deaths as well. We'll probably do a video on that, expanding on that more. But the Carter administration just said what happened there was totally legal and within our rights, even though if you look at the actual international law, as it has been presided for every other country and has now been effectively put forth towards the United States and its allies, it was unwarranted active aggressions that had no place in this world, especially whenever you're trying to be the peaceful president. Another one that I really like talking about Carter is during his campaign, which all presidents we know at this point are just telling you lies to try to get you to vote for them so they can do whatever they want. But he said that he wanted to eliminate the world's nuclear arsenal. And by the first month of his term, he was averaging 2 to 3 new nuclear armaments a day and spreading them out to our United States bases across the world. Which, take a quick pause, if you can tell me how many United States armed military bases there are in the entire world, including how many we have in Antarctica, I will give you a special prize in the comment section. If you Google it first, I'll know. So yeah, those are just the indirect things that Carter did. We talked a little bit about it with the Reagan administration, but it's important to mention here, because it started with Carter, the crimes and the fascism that led to numerous deaths in El Salvador. One of the most prominent examples of this is the Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was murdered by the right wing in the country, who had been threatening to kill him forever, and who the United States government, through Jimmy Carter's administration, actively supported and had no problem with this regime whatsoever that were continuing to murder civilians by the tenfold. Romero had been on death list for a long time until finally he sent a personal message to Jimmy Carter, because he was the archbishop, the highest Catholic Church official in El Salvador, and so he sent a personal message to Jimmy Carter saying, please stop supporting this terrible regime that is killing civilians and is cracking down on dissent harder than we've ever seen before, and please do something about it. The Carter administration, and I'm quoting from Manufactured Consents, page 48 here, the Carter administration had been so disturbed by Romero's oppositions to its policies, it had secretly lobbied the Pope to curb the Archbishop. So, later, a couple weeks after that letter, Archbishop Romero was murdered, and the Carter administration continued to supply weapons and arms to El Salvador, which got worse to the Reagan administration. I talked about that, and I think it's the least viewed video on this channel, but that kind of makes sense because we all kind of know about Reagan at this point, I would hope anyway. We then move on to the Iranian Revolution, which the Carter administration strongly opposed because it could not implement its will there. This expanded more during the Reagan and Bush era, and of course through the Clinton era as well, through the United States' good friend Saddam Hussein. But the Carter administration lobbied and sent its own officials there to try to push back with the military's assistance of the Iranian Revolution and say, hey, you guys can take them. And the Iranian military was like, there are so many more people than there are us. And a lot of them were on the side of the revolution because they'd seen the terrible things that happened through the overthrow of the Shah during the 1956 or 8 Eisenhower administration. So yeah, Carter was, as all American presidents typically are, anti-democracy, which we'll get into later because it applies to the domestic front. The next thing we have to talk about with foreign policy-wise is the Indonesian genocide in East Timor. Now, we'll probably make a whole video about this at some point. If you don't know about it, Noam Chomsky was really big in advocating for the people of East Timor, who were about as close to genocide until you got to Rwanda and other places in the world from the 58 invasion all the way up until the 90s. But the Carter administration, who once again we have to acknowledge was least violent when compared to other administrations of this time period, of our time period, the modern time period, he did, however, still find a way to get weapons to East Timor, even though the United States had publicly denounced what was happening there. But privately, and you can see all of this through the released documents that have come forth since then. I will have links in the description for you to look into, as always. But the Carter administration funneled weapons through Israel to funnel into Indonesia, who then used it to perpetuate genocide, in which tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, I don't have the right numbers in front of me, but Timorese people were murdered indiscriminately because that's how it works here. So that's the majority of the foreign policy issues as of now. Like I said, we're going to talk about Israel, Palestine, and Egypt, and the Camp David situation at the end of this video. But now we're going to go ahead and turn to the domestic side of things. So Carter, who ran as an outsider, you've heard that term 1,000 times before, an outsider running as a man of the people, was not truly a man of the people. I mentioned it before in my political landscape video, but the Carter administration hired and had several members on its cabinet as members of the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission was formed in a sense to understand the most dangerous things that were affecting democracy both in America and abroad that needed to change. The thing that they saw first and foremost that needed to change and was the most dangerous was the ongoing attacks on democracy by the general public of the United States, meaning the peace movement, the civil rights movement, the poor people's movement, and so on and so forth. These people saw that Americans, the working and poor classes, had too much of a say in their government, and this needed to change and go back to the ways of old. In fact, in their document, they actually say, quote, it needs to go back to the way it was in the 20s and 30s and before then, where bankers and corporate institutions had all of the say and Americans had very little to no say. And so thus starts the first slide down towards big money, getting into politics more than it had been before, and the corporate sector completely isolating out the working and poor classes and saying the private sector now will own politicians and do whatever they want. A lot of this stuff is often attributed to Ronald Reagan's administration, and rightfully so, because he definitely made it worse, but it all starts with Carter. Carter was the one who hired these people into his administration and became the big business president that they wanted. In fact, Carter was the first president to ever make it to where the railroad workers could not strike. He took away their only power as a union to make sure that they could never actually get what they wanted. They could never actually disrupt life the way they needed to in order to get better benefits. And that's something we have seen throughout the decades. Most recently in 2022, when Joe Biden went ahead and broke up the railroad workers union and prevented them from striking as well. The Carter administration also destroyed any sort of power that truck drivers have by breaking up their union, going in and saying this is illegal and we're going to break it up. And since then, truck drivers' wages have dropped by almost 20% every single year since then. And so if you're a truck driver and you're sitting there wondering why you're not getting paid well, why your benefits have fallen, anything else like that, you can go ahead and say thank you to Jimmy Carter. You have a 70 mile per hour speed limit, but you don't have the benefits that you actually need in order to be able to move forward with your life in a meaningful or productive way. Carter also used the Cold War, like all presidents used the Cold War, to continue big business spending. He assigned a few different people to prominent positions, most notably maybe the federal chair, who was the Wall Street pick, to increase the Wall Street ideas. He cut welfare policies that had been there for forever. Social Security took a big cut under the Carter administration, which would then take more cuts under the Reagan administration. And by this point in 2024, it's 2025, has almost completely been gutted to where it's obscurity and it doesn't mean anything anymore. Carter did incomprehensible damage to the United States working class and poor class through his policies. Just ultimately decimated them. He took away any sort of union's power that was existing at that time and led to Ronald Reagan to expand on these things by being able to fire the air traffic controllers through the policies that Jimmy Carter started. All of this starts with Carter. The privatization of the medical industry, education, prisons, all of it starts with Carter saying, big business is coming back to the White House and I'm going to be their guy. The only reason he wasn't elected for that second term is because Reagan was going to be a better person for big business who could get those things done faster and more effective and more extremely, which is what we saw. So in summary, the Carter administration, foreign policy-wise, was as detrimental as any administration has, just on a lower scale. through the funneling of weapons and support for Indonesia during its genocide in East Timor, during the support for the catastrophe in Chile, for the pushback of the Iranian Revolution, which would lead to almost probably millions of deaths by this point. And then also, as we discussed in the Reagan video, and we'll probably discuss during our video on manufacturing consent, which I would hope that you will read, the ongoing onslaughts by the far-right fascist government in El Salvador and the murder of Oscar Romero, as we've discussed. Domestic policy-wise, he busted up the unions. He slowly started the stripping of social welfare programs. He implemented policies that would allow big business to start to funnel in money and take over the White House and the Congress and the state and the small cities and towns that you see every day in your actual life. Even if you don't verbalize it, you know it's there. And so on and so forth. Now let's go ahead and talk about the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords were between Israel and Egypt, and effectively got Egypt out of the Arab military alliance and started the process of what is now commonly called as Arab normalization. The peace treaty that was signed between Israel and Egypt and the United States, and supposedly also was to affect the Palestinians, as it did pretty heavily, was in the absence of the PLO, who, even though they have their own problems that we'll talk about, the only world-recognized Palestinian representative was not present at this meeting. In fact, because of this, Israel pretty much got free reign to do whatever it wanted. In fact, shortly after the Camp David Accords were signed in peace treaty and the Israel military was able to build itself back up, they invaded Lebanon and led to the disastrous war there. They continued their occupation of Palestine, which was not even mentioned or referenced during the Camp David Accords, and so many other things that you can just continue to list. And Israel now has had a free reign to do all of this because the United States pretty much neutralized all of the threats around it outside of Iran and Lebanon and those who are in the Gaza Strip, who are pretty much helpless at this point to fight back outside of what we see them do every once in a while, like with October 7th, which was, once again, terrible. But it gave Israel free reign to continue to do what it has been doing for the last 40 years. None of this would have been possible without the Carter administration. Every time you talk about all of the different wars between Israel and Lebanon, the genocide on the Gaza Strip, the shrinking possibilities of life for Palestinians within the area that they have had for years and years and years, all of that starts with Carter at Camp David and getting Egypt out of there. Every time you ask people, or people debate this, they always want to ask, why doesn't Egypt let in the Palestinians? Well, there's a difficult political answer to that leads with the current political government of Egypt doesn't really like the Palestinians or the leaders of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and otherwise Hamas. But it's also because Egypt has no incentive by anyone to do anything other than just manage its own situation, which at this point is a pretty disastrous because of the events of the Arab Spring, which once again can go back to the Carter administration and Camp David. As always, I'd like to end this video by begging you at this point to please go into the links in the description. The first one, as always, is going to be the United States Campaign for Palestinian Rights. In this, you can find ways to take action. My favorites are emailing your representatives with either their generated email that they make for you, or they find your representatives for you, and you can make your own email with your own personalized touch saying why you are for the things that we are for. The ending of genocide, the stopping of arms being sent to Israel, and so on and so forth. There is also going to be a link for Food for Gaza, which is sending food hopefully sending food into Gaza without being intact, as has just happened a few weeks ago. Israeli forces almost murdered 5 World Food Organizations and World Health Organization workers who were just trying to bring aid into there. Oxfam said from October 15th to the end of December of 2024, only about 12 aid trucks had been let in. We know now that at least 8 babies have frozen to death because blankets and other abilities to warm oneself are not being let into the Gaza Strip. And we also know that there are no longer any real working hospitals and that we just have makeshift tents and so on and such forth. Please click these descriptions. Find ways that you can be active in stopping this. And I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something as always. But thank you so much. Oh, yeah. Oh, also, just one more thing on Carter. You can talk about his humanitarian aid when he was out of president. You can talk about his Carter Foundation, which supposedly did pretty great things whenever you look up its list on the internet, and I'm sure that it was effective at certain things. I don't really know why their CEO has 6 figures if they're a nonprofit organization. That's always kind of bothered me, but really none of it makes up for any of the stuff I talked about in this video. The Carter administration completely laid the foundation for the end of the freedom of choice in politics for the working class and poor people. It ended the power of unions until we have seen recently, and it set the groundwork for years and years of just total political isolation and choices only being made by the top 10 to 1%. So feel free to keep those little things in your heart, but overall, to me personally, they mean nothing. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you next time.